none of us are individual beings. We all belong to our communities and to wider society. You can take me and my dad, for example. We're a generation apart, but we're quite different in terms of how we navigate our emotional walls. That's not to say I'm perfect, and that's not to say he's imperfect. We just are as we are. We are products of the generation we're from. A big part of facilitation and the work that I do now is being true to the person that you are. The minute you're not, people will see it straight away and they will let you know. Support at its fundamental level is just people having a chat, feeling a sense of social connection. And I think that is something that is, of course, it is timeless. Human beings from the very start have done that process. I think it's very instinctual and it's very natural for people to want to do that with everything that is happening, right? That sense of like tectonic plates of wanting to heal, not just as individuals, but as communities. And what does that look like? I don't know. I just know that there's space for so much.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Illuminating Dialogues number 28, where I have the pleasure of talking to Taimour today from Taraki. How are you doing today, Taimour?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing very good, and thank you for joining all the way from Lisbon in Portugal. I would love to start this podcast off with diving into a lot of topics on what you guys are doing at Taraki, men's mental health. I think we both come from the South Asian background, mental health. I'd love to open up the conversation around that and share with the viewers about men's mental health, maybe work through some of the taboos there and the amazing work you guys are doing in Taraki. But before we jump into all of that, I would love to just introduce you for the audience. So Taimour is serving as a project lead at Taraki and managing and internationally scaling their mental health peer support education program. Taraki are working with Punjabi communities to shape positive futures in mental health by mobilising 4 key avenues of change: awareness, education, application, and research. Connecting with communities, upskilling healthcare workers, reflecting with researchers, and engaging with decision makers. So, before we jump into all of the great work you and Taraki are doing, this podcast is called Illuminating Dialogues. It's really a space for us to journey together and maybe a conversation and a flow of meaning that we haven't gone through before, and hopefully illuminate ourselves and the listeners as well. So my first question to you is, what lights you up?
A very good question. What lights me up? To be honest, what lights me up is football. I know it's not the most spiritual uh, response you would ever get on this podcast. But realistically, I'm someone who's quite systematic in terms of how I operate on a day-to-day. Of course, that shows in the nature of the work that I do. So I'm a project lead, but I'm also like autistic level 3. So my brain works in a very systematic, process-driven way. So on a day-to-day function, football lights me up because I love being able to connect the dots between things. And that for me is very beautifully shown by football because the ball goes from one person to another and then you strategically move forward. I sound very technical, but of course that's who I am. Um, but beyond that, what lights me up is being able to meet a person, getting to know a person, and being able to be surprised by a person. I think that's probably the biggest thing.
Wow.
I love that. I love that part of the human experience where you are surprised by what you learn about someone. And I think I've always been open to that, of course, more so now because of the work that I do. But that's one thing I look forward to every time I work with the different men in our program. I'm just curious and excited to learn and be surprised by seemingly hard men from hard environments. And you learn that they love poetry or something like that, which is seen as very non-masculine. So yeah, what lights me up is one, football, and two, learning surprising information about new people.
Wow, that's cool. And as an engineer myself, I have that systematic kind of mind frame. But I do coaching as well, which is like that more feminine or flowy side. And I'd love to dive into how you see that in a practical scenario, like you said, talking to people. Funnily enough, Ronaldo was just in my city yesterday, from Portugal.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, that's something there, if, in case you like Ronaldo's team.
yeah, well, not, I don't like the team that he's in now, but I've actually been here in Portugal. So yeah,
Nice man. So, if we could just kick this podcast off, let's say like a football match, with maybe exploring a bit about your journey. Like, how did you start to? I think you came from a marketing background. So how did you come from marketing, which is very like business savvy, into the domains of mental health landscape and your journey into the mental health area?
of course. So professionally, I have a marketing background, but about 10 years ago, or about 11 years ago, I started writing articles. So became a writer, online-based writer. And I remember I wrote an article about beards, which went viral, which was quite a big thing for me. Beards, applause for you, stigmatization for me. And then I wrote an article about what it means for me to be a brown man experiencing mental ill health because
Mm-hmm.
I went through a period of like severe anxiety and depression. So that article also did the rounds, especially in like, South Asian spaces or generally people of color spaces. Having done that, I almost became like a roadie. So whenever there was an event on mental health in South Asian communities, I'll be asked to go and speak. Um, so while I did the whole marketing thing, I did also the marketing. It was predominantly speaking at events. I felt like a roadie who would just talk about his experiences, which over time felt a bit cliched and a bit played out because even at the age of like 27, I would be talking about an article I wrote at the age of 23. I wasn't that person anymore. I wasn't that
Mm-hmm.
guy anymore. So I think it created like almost like a vacuum within me, having gone through mental ill health, to then, of course, individually raise awareness. But I think with mental health, awareness is only one part of it. I wanted to do something more. I wanted to feel like I was part of something. Um, so beyond just writing about mental health, I launched Expert by Experience, which was an initiative that looked at mental health in South Asian communities, which really blossomed over COVID. But parallel to that, I started attending Taraki's men's space support spaces.
Mm-hmm.
In November 2019, I attended my first space because, I was having my own sense of like challenge with my like South Asian identity. I never really felt like a fit in. And so, yeah, I started to attend these spaces so regularly that the facilitators would call me part of the furniture because I was there every month, whether it was in person, which it was at first, to online over COVID. So, about May 2021, the founder of Taraki, Jhoty, applied for some funding as part of November's big funding call to challenge social isolation amongst men all over the world. And he got that funding and he was like, Taimour, I would like you to lead this project. And I was like, you what? Are you sure you've got the right person? I have no mental health background. I have no educational background in terms of, being an educator. I have no project management background. I'm simply from marketing. But that was the first time in my life someone took a leap of faith in me. And here we are 3 years later, internationally scaling our peer support model. And I guess he had the foresight to know that someone who knows the space inside out
Mm-hmm.
would probably be the best person to lead the work. Not to say I'm the best person to lead the work, but someone who's been through that journey because theoretically you can teach someone peer support, but if they experience peer support and what the key ingredients are to cultivate that peer support space and that safety for men, it would be that person who spends most of their time in there. And fortunately for me, I was that person.
Mm. Wow, what a journey. And yeah, I think like especially for men and in the South Asian community, anxiety, depression is something that is very difficult to express, even put your finger on. Because I remember when I was in my university days, I didn't even know I was anxious. I was just going to the library watching YouTube like Star Trek, or like, watching YouTube and yeah, locking myself away there, and then being just really sweaty when I'm around people or like in public. And later I noticed, oh wait, that's anxiety. And there used to be a lot of like behavioral mechanisms, like going on my phone or just doing things like that, which I didn't realize, but was actually covering certain emotions. Um, Also for depression, I feel like that's kind of similar to anxiety, but in a sense, like we can't really define that, but and it's kind of hidden. But I think you could do a much better job of explaining it because you've held the space, you've been through it. So for people who don't know, who are watching this and are like heard about anxiety, heard about depression, maybe experienced something, how would you define and share what is anxiety and depression?
I think it's a very individualized experience. So for me, anxiety looks like constant uh, worry about the future or even the past. For me, anxiety feels like an impending danger that will never materialize because it's just constantly in my head. And specific to me, when it comes to depression, my experience of depression has been excessive sleeping,
Mm,
like a level of impulsivity, and yeah, a sense of like feeling disconnected from my emotions and my sense of well-being. Um, and having had both of those experiences about a decade ago in tandem, so I had anxiety, and of course, naturally, then I also developed a level of depression. For me, it just felt like a period where I was just constantly worried about the future, but at a time where I didn't feel connected to myself. So there was no way I could self-soothe or self-regulate because I just felt like I was almost like, I said this earlier when I was doing another media thing. It felt like I was just walking in the dark. So of course you feel that level of momentum that you're moving, but you don't know what direction because your eyes are closed. And so that's what the experience felt like for me. A very intense experience where you can feel the sensations in your body, but that sense of dysregulation and that lack of balance feels so offsetting. You just feel misguided and fearful.
mm. And how how could you begin to come from the inside to the outward world to actually understand what was going on? What helped you understand? Yeah, afterwards.
I think one of the biggest things was like my material world. So my I guess my real life got a lot better. Because when I had the experience of anxiety and depression, I couldn't hold down a job for like 2 years.
Mm,
So I got back into like a full-time job, which made a big difference. And also like other material experiences in my life got better. So I had like a stable home, which was really wonderful. I started to exercise again. So I felt like a lot of the things that allow you to come back into your body. So when I did my yoga teacher training, they said, and it still sticks with me, is get out of your head and into your body.
mm,
So for me, the period of healing was getting out of my head and into my body. And that looked quite different, but it encompassed quite a few different things, right? So like safe home environment. It meant getting back into physical exercise again. It
mm,
meant eating good foods, or at the time, what I thought were good foods were better than what I was eating beforehand. It also meant feeling socially connected to my friends and my family. So it was a long road. Realistically, it took me about 2 years to recover from that experience of being anxious and depressed.
mm. Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. And I think you also mentioned, and I found the same as well, connecting to the roots, like South Asian roots. So wherever anybody listening to this, maybe in European or South American, Africa, in Asia, roots, is there importance behind understanding your roots or fitting in, and mental health? Is there a correlation there that you found?
It's a really good point. I think my sense of faith has really developed since that period of like mental ill health that I experienced. Also my sense of like connection to want to connect to not just people in general, but also people who look like me or who might reflect similar life experiences as me. So it created that sense of like naturally quite a few of the anxieties and that sense of like disconnection I felt was because I felt like I wasn't connected to the communities I came from. And that's of course my own journey. Um, but yeah, for me, that sense of wanting, I think what I'm trying to say is that none of us are individual beings. We all belong to our communities and to wider society. And the big part of my healing journey, which is what has led me to where I am working at Taraki, was being able to or wanting to go beyond myself. So
Mm.
once I was able to heal myself, I naturally wanted to be able to make sure that men in the same position as me or had been or are going through what I did, I wouldn't necessarily want them to feel alone. So a big part of my healing within this journey has been to create that sense of community. And also, what is my role within the communities I come from? The reason I felt a level of disconnect is because I never felt like I fitted in. Like, what is my role? Not just in terms of like the communities themselves, but also specific to mental health. And I think a big part of the healing is that within all that, I found myself individually as a person, but also what my role is. And I feel like my role, specific to mental health from the communities that I come from, is the fact that I'm someone who kind of like, I'm the canary in the mines. I
Mm.
raise the alarm. And I just don't raise an alarm, I raise a conversation, hopefully. A conversation or two as a facilitator. Not necessarily as an agitator. I think I'm more of a facilitator, hopefully a bit more democratic, which means that, yeah, I'm able to like bridge the gap between people who think they might be different. Um, so, yeah, a big thing for me over the last decade has been finding myself, but also creating that sense of connection, like you say, to the communities I come from and understanding what role I play, which has ultimately allowed me to feel better within myself. And also, I think has positively impacted my sense of like mental well-being massively.
Mm. Yeah, it's so interesting you should share that. Like on the healing journey, and then you create your own, or not your own community, but at least you're serving a community that you're helping build. Because for me, I find, especially coming from a South Asian background, from you know Punjabi to UK, there's also like a collective healing that almost needs to happen, because I feel that having one's roots displaced over many generations, there's also like a community healing that needs to occur. And I feel like people are kind of grasping out and trying to fit in a wider sense. So we're trying to fit into our community, but the community is also trying to fit into the wider social um, play or structure. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of moving plates at the
Mm-hmm.
same time. And not just moving plates, but plates that are trying to actively heal.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I think it can get a bit messy sometimes. But I think for me, it's just one step at a time and also really sticking to the basics.
Mm-hmm.
Peer support for me fundamentally is quite beautiful because it is so simple. It doesn't necessarily require a level of like therapy based experience. It doesn't necessarily require a level of like mental health knowledge, which I know is quite accessible nowadays, but we have to look at the demographics of who it's available to, predominantly younger people on social media.
Mm-hmm.
Support at its fundamental level is just people coming together, having a sit, having a tea, having a chat, gup shop, whatever you want to call it, feeling a sense of social connection. And I think that is something that is, of course, it is timeless. Our ancestors and beyond that human beings from the very start have done that process. I think it's very instinctual and it's very natural for people to want to do that. So we just try to recreate that in a way that is culturally competent, with everything that is happening, right? That sense of like tectonic plates of wanting to heal, not just as individuals, but as communities. And what does that look like? I don't know. I just know that there's space for so much.
Hmm. And how do you, I'm just so interested, like, how do you make that space culturally competent? Because, like you said, we've been doing this for many generations, and it's very strange that suddenly we don't do this now. So I don't know what the factors are leading up to this. Maybe our jobs, maybe the way the world is, we're getting more isolated. So I'm very curious about how you're making this space culturally competent.
Of course, it might sound like rocket science, but it's not.
Mm.
The way we make it culturally competent is that we build, so at Taraki, we do the peer support facilitation training, but we also deliver peer support spaces. And really, it's about sticking to subjects and themes that kind of reflect the experiences of Punjabi men, right? So we're talking family expectations, we're talking things like masculinity, we're talking even something as important as like mixed marriages. So it's about, sticking to subjects that we know will resonate with Punjabi men wherever they come from. Of course, you have nuance based on geographical location, social class, etc. But we try to keep it as broad as possible, but with the context that it is culturally competent, recognizing that Punjabi men have their own unique sets of challenges and also their own unique set of lived experiences. And so it's just about understanding that and then being able to cater to do that through a variety of ways. One, of course, having facilitators that look like me, or the Punjabi facilitators that we have. Two, it's about understanding the subject matter and how that's going to kind of resonate with the people attending. And then three, there's just that sense of awareness work, which I think is quite important. And I feel like Turkey does that so well in terms of just really understanding Punjabi communities as well as we can and being able to speak to their challenges, being able to speak to their concerns and needs. And so, like, yeah, hopefully our peer support spaces reflect that. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I'd love to delve into those expectations because this podcast is illuminating dialogue. So I'd like to illuminate people watching this may be from a Punjabi background, South Asian background. So if we could start to delve into some of these topics, you mentioned expectations in the Punjabi culture. So what sort of expectations are we talking about that has come up that you see time and time again?
Of course. So on a family level, expectations based on, the subject that comes up in peer support spaces and also like something that I can kind of attest to is the fact that, yeah, there is a family expectation of what a man is and
Okay.
how a man behaves. A man is someone who provides financially, logistically. This sense of stoicism within Punjabi men is also expected. And and yeah, so that's just one particular big theme that tends to come up quite a bit. That sense of expectation of what it means to be a Punjabi man, and we kind of enter the dialogue from that perspective, but then also try to understand some of the limitations and also the kind of imprisonment it can kind of create. To have those expectations based on your gender and based on the cultural background you come from. Um, so that is a really, really good example of one thing that comes up in our spaces.
Mm. And yeah, I think we've definitely seen that, like in especially the previous generations, combining with having that Punjabi man, let's say, caricature, but then also having to provide because coming as a first generation, and then maybe that being passed down as well. So there's like almost an um, immigrant belief, and then there's also like the cultural belief. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering that expectation, um, what really is that? What really is that expectation, and is there any shifts you've seen in people just by discussing that stoicism or how what's expected of them?
I think it partly comes from a sense of necessity. So it's not something that just comes out of nowhere, right? It's not magically created for the sake of it existing. It exists because there's a need for it.
Hmm.
As mentioned, there's a sense of like first generation immigrants who are predominantly men coming across to be able to build a living for their families, for themselves. Um, and so I think we have to recognize that it is something that is built out of necessity. And then when you tie it into cultural expectations and you get like I guess the double impact of one, something that is necessary, but two, that is philosophically or culturally backed by something. Um, in terms of attitudes, I feel like attitudes are progressing or developing, which is quite nice to see. Even take me and my dad, for example. We're a generation apart, but we're quite different in terms of how we navigate our emotional walls. That's not to say I'm perfect, and that's not to say he's imperfect. We just are as we are. We are products of the generation we're from. But in the spaces that we hold at Turkey, you do see such a such a beautiful development in terms of how people navigate and see these subjects. Specific to expectations and masculinity. There's a desire to understand, explore, but there's also it doesn't necessarily come from a place of fear, which I can appreciate. There's not a sense of like, okay, this is bad, so we're just going to drop everything and we're going to try and go the other way. I can really appreciate the nuance that exists, and something I've noticed quite, not to say recently, but something that's developing quite beautifully is the fact that that ability to be like, okay, this has served us well in the past, but it's not necessarily serving us now.
Mm.
And this is serving us well, but we might not necessarily know how it might serve us in the future. But that's the thing, right? With each generation, you get the opportunity to do it, but you do get to do it hopefully better and in a more loving and positive way. So yeah, I've seen a lot of changes in attitude, even in the last 10 years that I've been doing the whole mental health gig, I guess. Um, but that's across all generations. It's not something that's unique to the younger generations.
Hey everybody, sorry to interrupt your podcast, but if I could please ask you to take the time to like and subscribe to this channel. It would help us as we try to grow this channel and share our guests' deep wisdom with you and the rest of the world. What lights you up? Why do I ask this? Because I want to create a space for you to go slow to go far and offer a space of one-to-one coaching, and I'll put some testimonials up here. This will allow you to access all of the wisdom for our illuminating dialogues, actually integrate and implement this wisdom in your daily life for whatever means you'd like to transform, live in alignment, live in purpose, and of course live in your dharma. If that resonates with you, you can book a session directly with me on jhoty.com. If you would like to join the free community, you can also go to jhoty.com. All the links are in the description, and connect with like-minded people where we also have a chat about the next Illuminating Dialogue podcast episodes. So thank you again, everybody, for supporting this podcast. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this podcast. So yeah, I'm just wondering if we could go into one of the topics actually you mentioned previously, which is really interesting, about the article about having a beard and being South Asian. Like, so why do you think that went viral about having a beard?
So this was about 10 years ago. So I was 22.
Okay.
And, 10 years ago, beards became quite trendy and they still are trendy. And I remember feeling a bit, for the sake of being professional, annoyed
Okay.
at that, someone like me, when I grow a beard, I'm seen as a terrorist or a threat to society. But then when like white guys started doing it, especially hipsters, it was seen as like so sexy and attractive.
Mm.
And so I wrote an article for Media Diversified at the time, and the article went viral. It was massive. And the thing is, I don't think I said anything that was radical in any way. It was more that there was an admission of truth that no one had said at the time. So it caught on like wildfire, and it was just so interesting experiencing this as a 22-year-old kid who hadn't really done that well in his GCSE. So I almost had like a chip on my shoulder
Mm.
for me to have these grown adults at the time and like academics being like, "Wow, your work is so good," and I'm just like, "Well, I don't think it's rocket science in any way. It's just me recognizing that there's a double standard when it comes to facial hair and the color of your skin." Um, but yeah, it was let's just say it was illuminating, just to honor the name of the podcast. Um, but yeah, honestly, looking back, the way I wrote that article was a mess. It was too academically written, but it's just part of the journey of like
Mm.
a big thing for me is like humility. I'm human as hell. Um, and I think a big part of the work that I do now with Taraki is having the humility to recognize that I really try not to believe my own sense of self, because I think we all can have an inflated sense of self. And I think it's good to have a healthy self-esteem, which is where I'm trying to get to. But I think early experiences like that can kind of inflate your sense of self. And I kind of had to drop all that naturally. And I think I was at a time in my life where I was ready to do that because the work that I do now at Taraki, which is working with everyday men, if you go in with an approach that isn't true or authentic, the men in the space, for them who it's such a big thing to come to their first peer support space, they'll say through that like butter, and they will not trust you. A big part of facilitation and the work that I do now is being true to the person that you are. The minute you're not, people will see it straight away and they will let you know.
Wow. Yeah, that's very powerful. And yeah, even that you're mentioning about the double standards, they exist in so many places. People sometimes don't even question. But then, like you said, when you just point it out, suddenly that becomes aware in people's eyes, you know. And sometimes these things just status quo is just right. Um, so I'm just wondering, we talked a lot about masculinity, and I'm just wondering, what is masculinity? Because that is a big loaded term. It's a big term. How do you even start to approach that?
It's a really good question. In all honesty, I don't think I have an answer for you, which is quite a hopefully not disappointing response, but I get this question quite a lot. What is masculinity? What does it mean? And naturally, about 5 to 8 years ago, I would have rejected that sense of like, yeah, everything I thought around masculinity, I believe to be toxic. And I would almost like reject my sense of masculinity. In the last few years, that view has radically changed because I think I work with men from all the broad spectrum of their sense of masculinity. So, in very simple language, I come across a variety of men from different ages, from different backgrounds, from what they perceive as masculinity, what they perceive as hypermasculinity, what they perceive as what it means to be a man. I really don't have a broad answer for that. My definition or my view on masculinity is that I try to embrace as much positive elements of my masculinity as I can, and I try to interrogate as much of my the parts of my masculinity which I feel or people point out to me are not as positive or as progressive as they can be.
Mm.
And that's really where I'm at. Um, I don't necessarily have any like revolutionary response to this question other than the fact that I'm still figuring it out.
Mm. Yeah, it's amazing. It just points to the fact that Yeah, life's a journey, but it's so interesting, like you said, there's a whole breadth of it. Because traditionally, when you see masculinity, what pops into the mind is like Arnold Schwarzenegger or Rocky, right? But then you think about, you have Van Gogh and you have Leonardo da Vinci, right? They're also masculine, but they have a different sort of power. And it's like, yeah, well, what is masculinity and what is hyper and what is not hyper? And I think there's certain aspects in society like over controlling, or we've seen traditionally in Punjabi communities there can be some sort of silence there, some sort of anger, suppression of anger when there's an element that's not been healed. So I'm wondering, in terms of before maybe they come to the peer support group and they're working through their masculinity, why some of these controlling nature, a bit of anger, why that might be there, and maybe why that might not be resolved or healed yet. Because I feel like that's a big thing within masculinity.
It's a very good question, and it's something that I can, I guess, speak to through my own experiences. I think boys are generally taught to resort to anger quite fast, and I'm one of those boys. And I feel like even for the men who come to our spaces, I was just broadly based on the broad range of men that I know, anger is quite a go-to response for a lot of us, including myself. I feel like the peer support spaces, for some people, it might be resolved, but before they get to the space, for others, it might become slowly, very slowly resolved as they come more and more to our program. But I think most men have a journey with anger as to what they make of it, how they navigate it, how they use that emotion. And it's a very complex journey. Of course, in the program, in the space that we run, we do address things like anger. Um, but it's really interesting. And maybe it's a cultural thing. Um, but just addressing someone's anger can feel quite offensive.
Hmm.
So we do try to take a bit of a softer approach. It's about addressing the elephant in the room without actively calling it out. Because yeah, people can take offense to that sense of being called aggressive or having aggressive behaviors.
Hmm.
We really try to take a long-term approach. Um, Speaking based off experience, I know that I have a relationship with anger. It's not something that I will ever end. And I do think anger to a degree is a good emotion to have. It kind of it puts you into action when you need it. But it's just about that sense of balance. And speaking as a man, I feel like I've not necessarily had the best relationship with anger, but I find that it becomes less shameful to admit and speak to it when you're in a space with other men who feel relatively similar to you. Um,
Hmm.
and hopefully in Passport we get to do that.
Yeah, I've actually never went deep into that topic of anger and shame and maybe guilt around that, but that's actually a really good point because because I work also in corporate and speaking up your emotions or being a bit assertive is also seen as, and I think also a lot of the women and women's empowerment groups would say it's very shameful for them to actually express anger, but obviously in a more curated way or channeled way. So I feel somewhat that on one side, anger has been suppressed and you've been told like you're bad, or society has been told you're bad or uncivilized. But on the other side, there's like maybe an unhealthy, um, goading on that, anger's good and just like that's what makes you a real man. But like you said, it's almost a balance between that. So it's really curious about how do you address on one side that shame and guilt, but the other side not offend people. So how do you, like, could you give an example of what sort of questions do you ask, or how do you take that approach to start to have that dialogue around anger for South Asian men?
It's a really good point. I think a good segue into this subject is by understanding how you're taught anger.
Ah,
And to be honest, my earliest examples of understanding anger, I mean, I grew up in Pakistan,
mm-hmm,
right? Pakistan can be violent as a city, as a country. I've seen men beat up women by the age of 6, 7, like full on pelting. I've seen that up front. I've known my friends' dads who are alcoholics and they beat their children up.
mm,
I've seen a lot of violence and I've seen a lot of anger. So it's about interrogating what is your relationship with anger and what was your first few exposures to it. Like I said, I think anger is a good emotion that makes you feel like you want a justified response if a situation is deserves that. But I think a really good place to start, yeah, like I said, is asking people, what are your earliest examples of seeing someone angry? You get them to interrogate that. Oh yeah, I saw my dad slap my mom, or I saw
mm,
my dad beat up my brother, or even myself. And once they're able to see it from that lens where you've experienced the brunt of anger, and then kind of reflect it onwards to yourself, like, how do you deal with anger?
mm,
That's a really good way to be able to get them to interrogate anger. And you see that on a generational level as well, right? Like I said, I've seen men hit women in Pakistan quite a bit. Even my own dad, I've seen him hit my mom.
mm.
You see that as a child. Of course, there's a lot more nuance, but generally, even research shows that men who see domestic violence as kids, there's a percentage of them that will reenact that level of domestic violence as they grow up.
Mm,
And so it's just, in a way, it's reflecting, just putting a mirror in front of them, being like, what kind of anger have you seen? And how has that shaped the kind of anger you have within yourself? How do you express that anger? How do you display that anger? Who does it come out on? And I think just getting them to reflect on their relationship and especially the origins of their anger, I think is a good approach.
wow. Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that, because I think people who watch this will really reflect about actually how they experience the anger and the emotions in their childhood from their parents or ancestors directly influences how it shows up in them, right? Their inner child, or how their emotions. Like I personally have, um, like with my anger, it would not be like a outburst. It would be more of a suppression, right? So kind
Yeah.
of the opposite in a way. So that is a bit harder and a bit more nuanced, because I wasn't born in India or Pakistan. I was born in UK. So maybe the wider cultural view of anger could also be. I haven't delved into this yet, but it could also be different, and so that could also be nuanced as well, like suppression of anger as well. I don't know
Yeah,
if that has come up in any of your talks.
it does. Especially as we become more corporatized to a degree, that
Mm-hmm.
sense of holding anger within and what that does to us as people. That's
Mm-hmm.
also a good conversation to have. Because yeah, you can't go around shouting at people, which is also an unjustified response. But it's really interesting, that nuance of like, how do you express anger? I know what it looks like for me. I mean, I started doing martial arts at the age of 19.
Mm-hmm.
Like I go and get that anger out at martial arts in a way that's in a controlled environment. Um, but in a personal context, I still don't necessarily have a good grasp of my own anger. And just constantly that balance between, yeah, that balance between what is a healthy expression of my anger versus what is not healthy. And people always tend to presume shouting at someone is an unhealthy response of anger, but so is withdrawing and shutting down. That's still an extreme response to your situation.
Mm.
Uh, and yeah, so it's interesting. When it comes to anger, I have no answers. I only have more questions.
Sometimes that's the best spot to be in. But yeah, that's a very actually interesting topic that I've never delved down in. I think it's a very um, big topic in masculinity, actually. Um, I think we did touch on it in a previous illuminating dialogue with one of my friends, Sunny. Actually, unfortunately, his dad passed away early on, and he shared that his anger he directed into I think it was boxing and also his business, so in that healthy way. And that was the first time I really understood that this form of anger can actually be transmuted and doesn't actually
Mm.
need to be shamed. So yeah, really, really powerful insights. um, and when you were talking about elephant in the room, my mind also went to vulnerability. And I think as men, men, masculine, having that masculine energy, I believe we also have a feminine energy inside of us still. So, um, why is it hard for a lot of men to open up about emotions compared to our female counterparts, especially in the South Asian community?
It's a really good question. I'm pretty sure my girlfriend would have a better response to this than I do myself. Um, Realistically, I think for me, there's a sense of like vulnerability brings with it a level of like discomfort and shame, which I struggle to navigate. And I think it's also true for quite a few men. Because generally the way masculinity is designed is that the people who are vulnerable will naturally then be used in a way because the more stoic and the more domineering you are, the less you leave yourself open to vulnerability because you can get used in that sense. But I guess specifically speaking to my own experiences, I think it creates a level of vulnerability which I feel like a lot of men are not ready to expose themselves to, which means that often we can be quite unwilling to embrace like softer slash feminine parts of us, um,
Hmm.
which comes at the risk of not being connected to people that love us or that we love.
Mm. Yeah, so that vulnerability and our own emotions directly impact to that connection to our
Yeah,
relationships.
exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly. Bell Hooks said that, she wrote it in a book, in The Will to Change, that patriarchy expects men to be able to cut a part of themselves off, to be able to fit into into patriarchy, right? Patriarchy affects both men and women. And so for us, there is that sense of like self-mutilation of our emotional world.
Mm.
We can be in a very uh, competitive world, which is defined by patriarchy.
And this patriarchy, is this something that's new? Or is this something that has existed for a long time? Or, yeah, what exactly is this?
Yeah, so I would never say I'm an expert on patriarchy, especially as a man. But it's effectively the system within which men are able to have a lot more power than women and other genders over a very long period of time. And of course, it has a detrimental effect on women and other folks, but also requires a level of sacrifice from men in order for them to be able to navigate, but also, um, yeah, move up the ladder of what we define as like masculinity.
I see. So it's like a self perpetuating system in a sense that, okay,
Exactly,
okay.
exactly.
Cool. Yeah, thank you for explaining that. And just as we begin to slowly wrap up, you also mentioned really nice topic, which was about mixed marriages. Um,
Yeah.
so I was wondering, could you give us some insight into how you're approaching mixed marriages, what people's different views are, opposing views are on this, and how you help to bridge that gap between opposing views.
So one of the best ways to bridge the gap is just by holding a space, which is what we did at Turkey. And it was one of the most beautiful spaces I've ever facilitated because you had men, Punjabi men who are married to like a Japanese woman, someone who's married to like a white Irish woman. So there's a beautiful diversity of like mixed marriages and Punjabi men in beautiful mixed marriages. And it was just about understanding it comes down to choice. If you want to marry within the communities, feel free to do so. If you want to marry outside because you love the person for who they are, feel free to do so. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from that session was understanding that it comes down to choice. And really, the most beautiful gift that we can give each other, because I feel like it can get very tense when it comes to marrying within your communities or outside of your communities, is give to others what you would want to receive from yourself. If you want the freedom to be able to do as you wish, then extend that on to other people, especially when it comes to the matter of love.
Mm. Wow, very nicely said. And in term, because it does, I think marriage is such a big thing. Like we celebrate it big in South Asian communities. There's a lot of status involved about marriage and stuff as well. Um, in South Asian communities, why do you think it is that there's a lot of, and not just in for men, but just in general in the South Asian or Punjabi communities, why do you think a lot of judgment or social pressure exists when it comes to yeah, not giving a lot of leeway sometimes or having certain expectations there?
Again, I think it comes from a necessity of function as well, to a degree. Of course, there's a cultural expectation, but also we have to understand that historically, marriage within our communities, I'm no expert, but is contextualized in the sense that like it provides safety, but not just for the individual, but also the families.
Oh,
It comes from a level of necessity in a South Asian context. So, of course, when you mix that in with cultural expectations, it becomes this hotbed of so much tension and stress and so much pressure, which I think can impact the level of like love that is needed in the equation. So I think it's just about understanding it from that perspective. And as cliche and cheesy as it sounds, to try not to lose that perspective on love and over the transactional elements.
oh wow. What an amazing place, I think, to wrap up on the topic of love. Thank you so much just for sharing all of that journey on Punjabi communities, masculinity, the amazing work and space you're holding and sharing your journey. I think the viewers will appreciate that a lot. And I think you've illuminated a spot on many topics that I think I myself have not journeyed into yet. Um, is there anything else you would like to leave the viewers with today, based on your journey or anything at Taraki?
Um, I've learned this recently over the last year. Congruence. What is true within you, try to express that outwardly. Because I think the more true to yourself that you are, the more authentic life you can live. And I think none of us can ask for anything more. So yeah, I would want to leave it on that part.
Amazing. As my meditation teacher said, the best city to live in is authenticity. So, where can people find you, find Taraki if they want to connect to that space, or if they want to inquire, or even get some support for them or a loved one?
Of course, so you can find us on social media at Turkey HQ. And we have a website, turkey.co.uk. And within there, you'll be able to find resources, research, the spaces that we run. And also, you'll have access to me should you choose to follow me or reach out to me in any way. I'm there 24/7.
Oh, thank you. And I'll put all the description links below as well, in case people want to connect. Thank you so much again for your time and sharing all of that today. And thank you everybody for taking the time to listen.
My pleasure.
Thank you.